Hello everyone and welcome to this talk. My name is Stanislav Štěpánik. I work at the Department of Czech Language and Literature and the Faculty of Education at Palacký University in Olomouc, and I was the Czech Worth Institute Fellow in 2013-2014. I would like to thank the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies for continuing the project of virtual Central European cafes and for giving us, the former Worth Institute Fellows, the opportunity to come back and to present what we've been doing since we left Edmonton. I'm going to talk about research that I did together with my colleague, very good friend, and a fantastic Czech language teacher, Veronika Mátlová. And I'm going to talk about the cognitive-communicative conception of teaching Czech in upper secondary school. The motto is linking theory and practice. Last year, I presented theory. I presented this book. It actually got published shortly after I sent in my presentation. This book contains the theoretical background for my talk. It contains the outcomes of a project that I did together with my colleagues, in which we were looking for an innovative conception of teaching Czech in school. And this theory is the subject of my talk this year as well, but now in practice. Together with Veronika, we decided to do action research. We conducted a practical intervention in school where we took the theoretical background, the theory, and we put it into practice because we created the learning and teaching environment according to the theoretical fundaments presented in the book. We did it to link the gap between educational theory, that is research, and educational practice, and to investigate the results of the new conception we worked on in practice. Because what we need in education, not only in education, is evidence-based innovations. The research question for my talk and for the research that we did was, what are the ways and conditions of implementing the cognitive-communicative paradigm into teaching Czech in year 1 of upper secondary school? And I'm not going to review the whole theory, because you can watch the presentation from last year or even read the book, but just some fundaments that we used for creating the learning environment for our students in the research. The fundamental paradigm was from text to language and back. By text, I don't mean only written text, but also spoken texts. We could use the word discourse in English or communication. So first the students work with the text, they work with communication, and then they observe the language that is used in the texts in communication. And after they observe the language, they go back to communication and apply the knowledge they got in their own communication practice. What I mean by language, it is not your knowledge about language, or in a narrower sense, grammar. The basic fundament is integration of teaching language and communication, or composition as it is traditionally called in Czech. The word in Czech is sloh. But what I mean here is teaching, the integration of teaching grammar and communication. The teaching processes are based on the communication aim. Language is not presented as a value of its own, or grammar is not presented as a value of its own and as an isolated phenomenon, but it is presented as a means of communication. It is presented as a tool that is given to us in the language system to express certain meanings. The basic teaching process is textocentrism. The teaching processes are based on text, on discourse, on communication. So language is presented as a system that functions not isolated, but in context. That's why we don't use artificial decontextualized examples, but we use texts, because there students can observe the function the language means have. They can observe how the language means, the individual language means, serve certain communication purposes, how they serve the communication aims of the producer, how they achieve certain communication aims with us as the readers or the listeners, how they work in the context of the communication situations. The teaching processes are constructivist. That is, that teaching is based on the pupil's preconceptions, their experience with knowledge, their pre-understanding of how language works. And also knowledge from primary and lower secondary school, because we are in the first year of upper secondary school. Constructivism puts a great emphasis on pupils' activity. So the teaching processes that we use are highly pupil-centered. Emphasis is also put on pupils' communication needs. That is why we use current language, current texts, up-to-date contexts. And knowledge about language is presented in the communicative functional frame. The basic question that we ask is, what is the function of the given language means in communication, in this certain text? What does this language, this choice of language, do with the text? What does it achieve with the reader or the listener? And so on. And most importantly, we not only analyze, but also let the students produce. That's a very important thing, because then they can also try and search for their own choices. How was the research done, and what are its results? The research aim was to research possibilities and limits of applying the cognitive-communicative approach in teaching Czech in upper secondary school. Cognitive, that is, that we develop thinking about language and language thinking in general, and communication, that is, we develop the communicative skills of the students. So it is both knowledge about language and communication. It is not an agrammatical approach. We had two classes as the research sample, two classes of year one of Economic Lyceum in Prague. The Economic Lyceum, that is a 4-year upper secondary school program. It ends with the so-called maturita, or in English, the school leaving exam. These two classes presented an experimental and a control group. The experimental group was taught by Veronika. It had 26 pupils, and they applied the experimental teaching strategy based on the principles that I've just presented. And the control class was taught by Berta. There were 25 pupils, and they applied the traditional teaching strategy. Just to say, the traditional teaching strategy is highly grammar-based, grammar-centered. I'm going to present an example later so that you know what I really mean by the traditional teaching strategy. And now, how the research went. The basic content that we covered was morphology, lexicology, and syntax, and writing a story. We started with a pre-test, which was an essay. Why an essay? Because writing is the most cognitive, challenging process that students undertake in school. In pupils' writing, you see how they practically use language, how they think about language, and you can observe the language in function. That is, you can observe their language communication skills, what they know about language, how they really use it, what their knowledge and skills are like. We used an essay also in the middle of the research, that is in January, and we finished with an essay at the post-test after the intervention, which was in May. So you can see that the research took place from September to May, which is quite a long period. Review of morphology, lexicology, and syntax, as I've already said, was the main topic. In the experimental class, the review was done through text analysis and production, textocentrism. That's the thing that I've already spoken about. In the first part, it was done on artistic texts. In the second part, always in integration with communication and composition, on non-artistic texts. In the traditional or control class, it was done through traditional exercises using textbooks. I'm going to present an example later. Morphology, syntax, and also lexicology, more as grammar. And writing a story, which was also a part of the task, writing a story in the experimental class was understood as art of narration or as a specific genre, whereas in the control group, it was just an isolated genre with its characteristics the students had to remember. To give you an example what the teaching procedures looked like, in the experimental group, we took an extract from a fantastic book called Zvočení by a well-known author, Antonín Bajaja, which is very emotional. It is quite fast. The action that goes on in the extract is quite fast, very intense, rather intriguing, and very emotional. It is, from the reader's point of view, attractive because of the choice of the language the author uses, the composition that he uses, how he works with language in the text. And the basic question for the students while working with this text, we used many texts, this was one of them, was how is attractiveness of this text achieved? And the answer was based on the analysis of the topic, the narrator, the characters, the composition, the lexis Bajaja uses, the syntax Bajaja uses. So basically the observation of the text was done on many levels, but it started with the overall impression the students get from the text. And then we were looking at the individual elements that form this impression. And after the analysis, there was application. That is, that the students were asked to write their own text using the principles that we spoke about in the class. So that's also the usage of what they learned. In the control group, I'm going to show you some examples, what they did. And I'm going to show you examples from textbooks that are quite traditional. For example, morphological exercises in the traditional meaning of teaching Czech language in school can look like this. Exercise 4. Conjugate the verb to buy and to laugh in present conditional. That's it. So the students are asked to give forms of these verbs in present conditional only. It's not about function, it's not about use, it's not about communication. It's just conjugate the verbs. Exercise 6. Transform the verbs from active to passive and write the sentences. And then you have some isolated sentences which the students are asked to transform. In B6b, it is vice versa. So they are asked to transform the verbs from passive to active. And again, on isolated sentences. Again, no function of the passive-active, and no research of what this language means does with the sentences. It's just transforming, we could say, rather mechanical if the students are able to do it. And they are, because they are native speakers. Forming the passive or active is not a problem for a native speaker. That is the biggest problem with these exercises, because native speakers are able to form the passive and active. They might have problems with using it in the right place, but not with forming it. But usage is not the subject of these exercises. Exercise 11. Put the verbs into the correct form. A, the verb to send, second person plural past conditional. Technical note, past conditional is a really archaic form in current Czech. It's like 19th century, so not used, very peripheral. 11b, put the verb this time to learn in the third person singular future indicative. So these are the typical morphological exercises. I could comment on those for quite a long time. The problem with these is, as you can see, they are very much grammar oriented, they are grammar based. So even though native speakers are able to use the forms, they are able to make the forms A, B, D in exercise 11 very commonly. C could be a problem, but it is rather peripheral. The thing is that even though the native speakers use the forms, they might not be realizing the grammatical categories that are with these, that come with these verbs. And if it were vice versa, or if it were about functions, if it were about a communication, then it would be fine. But the problem is here that even native speakers might not be able to solve these exercises if they do not know the grammatical terminology here. So these students are automatically left out. And that's why their motivation drops. And we know from quite a lot of research that Czech is not a popular subject, that it is perceived as highly theoretical. You can see the reasons why. How we documented the results during our research, we used essays, as I've already said, observations throughout the whole period of the research. We also used a teacher's self-reflection, because both teachers kept a journal in which they reflected what was going on in their teaching. And it was also interviews between the academic, me, and the teachers. You can see that we applied qualitative methodology because we wanted to look at the qualities of what was going on in the teaching process. And the research results. In the experimental group, we saw higher time demand, obviously. When you want to go deeper, when you give the students place, when you give them the responsibility for their own learning, when you put them in the center of the lesson, it takes more time. But the lessons were lively, and we observed quite high increase in pupils' motivation. Even pupils that usually ignore what's going on in the class, or are afraid or shy to say anything, those with bad marks, the lower achieving pupils and less motivated pupils got involved. And they were active in the class. So it shows that the cognitive-communicative paradigm helps low achieving children, might help lower achieving students, because it gives equal conditions to everyone. We also observed that more content was covered, more texts, more knowledge about language phenomena, because the content was presented as a complex, not as isolated parts. but together. What Veronika also observed was the decrease in the need for marking in favor of formative assessment. She used formative assessment much more than marks. And this is also clear why. The reason is clear. It's connected to what has been already mentioned, because the students had higher internal motivation, and so they didn't need external motivators. What we also observed from the language point of view, in the post-test, in the experimental group, we observed improvement in composition skills, increase in originality of expression, but stagnation in spelling and punctuation. The control group had better results in spelling and punctuation, so in the form, worse results in composition, originality, and so. So this is quite interesting, especially as far as motivation is concerned, because that is crucial for any learning that we do. And we have a long-lasting problem with this in L1, first language, teaching in the Czech Republic. So what did we learn through the research? We learned that the cognitive-communicative conception to L1 teaching does bring positive results, but also has certain limits. I've mentioned those. So we know how to alter the conception now to focus on the formal aspects as well. We also observed freedom in modeling one's own lessons, because when you are given a text, there are a lot of things that you can go through. But the teachers, these innovative teachers, might be restricted by the school educational programs of the given schools they work in. Czech teachers have very high autonomy. They are one of the most autonomous teachers from the OECD countries. Why? Because the government gives only framework educational programs. According to these framework educational programs, each school writes its own school education program, and it depends on the teachers of the subject in the school what they put into their school educational program. Then they have to, of course, follow the program that they wrote for themselves. The problem is that Czech teachers don't know how to use the opportunities given by the framework educational program, which gives them enough space for innovations, and they are not ready for being autonomous professionals. So usually they rewrite textbooks. And here we are with the problem with the school educational program. It's mostly rewritten textbooks, those textbooks that I showed you. So the innovative colleagues, the innovative teachers might see the restrictions imposed on them by the school educational programs as quite a big obstacle in realizing the innovations in their own work. Interestingly, Veronika also observed the emphasis on what I want them to learn and how, instead of what I'm going to teach today. So really the focus on the pupils and reaching the aims for them, for the students. It's more thinking about the students and their needs, what they are going to learn today, instead of what I'm going to do there. The role of the teacher is crucial in terms of creating the learning environment. But then in the lesson, the teacher steps aside and lets the students do the learning, because that is the most important thing. They need to do the learning for themselves. That is absolutely vital. Well, and the last thing that we learned is that contact of theory and practice is possible, and not only possible, it is essential for the advancement in field didactics, and also for the advancement of the teacher's abilities and competencies. What I spoke about here is written in this book, Když výzkum mění praxi, When Research Changes Practice, edited by Gregor Simonová, Chvál and Straková, and published last year at the Faculty of Education at Charles University in Prague. The chapter describing what I spoke about is presented in this book, together with 9 other chapters that bring the stories of other teachers and academics that got involved in action research and tried some practical interventions in their own teaching. The book is available online. You can have a look at that one. It is very, very interesting. Should you have any questions or any comments, please get in touch. The email address is here. Thank you very much for your attention, and please give me a good mark. Thanks.